Pleasure to be here today and to see a capacity. This is terrific. The B&T may be dead, but it's still alive and well here. So this is great to see. A great debt of gratitude is due the founder of these conferences, who started these a little over 8 years ago in Virginia City, and convinced many of us that there would be a market. If you hold a conference, people will come. And we owe that debt of gratitude to Thomas B. Smith, who is with us from New York. Tom, thanks for getting this started. I want to talk today about a new book that we have available that has not previously been available. It's a report that was done for the Virginia and Truckee in 1949. And I want to read a one-page introduction that I did for it, and then we'll look at some of the visuals for that report to sort of try and familiarize you with this. The handwriting was on the wall for the Virginia and Truckee in mid-1948, at least as far as the railway owners, the Mills estate, were concerned. Third-generation descendants of Darius Ogden Mills had little patience or sentimentality for a railway that had been losing them money for more than 20 years. The B&T liaison with the Mills estate in San Francisco was an attorney named Duncan MacLeod, who served as B&T secretary, B&T treasurer, B&T attorney, and he was also a member of the B&T board. He had just a little bit of influence over what was going on. Impending abandonment applications to the U.S. Interstate Commerce Commission and the Nevada Public Service Commission would be strengthened with a comprehensive assessment by independent consultants as to the state of the railway. Duncan MacLeod was in regular written and telephone communication with B&T Vice President Gordon Sampson in Carson City. In mid-1948, MacLeod directed Sampson to arrange for a detailed engineering report to be undertaken by qualified local consultants. The report would assess the physical condition of the railroad and recommend what would be needed to rehabilitate the line for safe and legally compliant operation. Increasing accidents, derailments, advancing age of the physical plant, and lack of finances were all considerations. The result was a 3-member consulting team consisting of Robert A. Allen, Arthur E. Holgate, and Barney E. Stutenberg. Allen headed up the team. He worked 4 years, 1903 to 1907, at the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company steel rail manufacturing plant at Pueblo, Colorado. So he had some pretty early rail experience. Following a distinguished public career as state engineer, a member of the Nevada Public Service Commission, he was the Federal Public Works Administrator, and then 12 years he was the state highway engineer. Allen set up a private engineering practice in Carson City. Holgate was the Washoe County engineer. He had an office in the courthouse annex in Reno. And Stutenberg was a local general contractor who had done railroad jobs throughout the region. All 3 men were employed directly by the B&T for the study. The first step of the assessment was a confidential 6-page letter dated July 21st, 1948, sent by Sampson to each of the consultants and also to his boss, Duncan MacLeod. The consultants then undertook their work over a 4-month period from December 1948 through about February of 1949. The result was this comprehensive 71-page report. When the weather improved, 31 captioned 8x10 black and white photographs were added. Arrows and circles were applied in red to many of the photos to highlight the detailed physical condition of the railway. The images were taken under Allen's direction by Carson City photographer John Stiles as the 2 traveled the right-of-way aboard a B&T motor car. And we'll see pictures of that shortly. The motor car shows up in several of the images. They also took extra photographs, which the consultants did not include in the report, but we've included them in here anyway. In January 1949, the B&T applied to the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Nevada Public Service Commission for authority to abandon all operations. The report and the photos were submitted as exhibit number 2 by Allen during the May 2nd through 4th, 1949 hearings, which were jointly conducted in Carson City by the ICC and the Nevada PUC. The testimony lasted 17 and a half hours over 3 days. Alan was the fourth witness in the proceedings, and Alan led the commissioners through the report and all of his photographs that we're going to take a look at. The ICC took them a little while, 11 months, to make their decision, but it came down on April 19, 1950 in support of the B&T's abandonment. The engineering report had done its job. The report is arranged numerically by the prevailing ICC classification accounts. The consultants assessed each area, made recommendations, and then provided cost estimates. Team leader Allen, an admitted local historian, reached into the B&T's 1917 valuation survey for as-built or rebuilt dates, as well as an awful lot of construction details. He then drew upon the B&T staff and a great body of working files since 1917 to establish the condition of the railway. Every bridge, every structure along the railway, they assessed every length of rail and wrote it down. The consultants went bridge by bridge through every structure and walked the entire right-of-way. They noted in detail the condition of the roadbed, drainage, fencing, ties, and all the rails, which were primarily 60-pound between Reno and Carson City and 56-pound relay on the Minden branch. The consultants' findings were that a significant investment was required, between $2.5 and $3.5 million, depending on whether you would choose new or relay rail, whether it was going to be 60-pound, 75-pound, or 90-pound steel rail. In the case of the cavernous 11-stall Carson City engine house, they recommended construction of a modern 2-stall engine house. After all, they said you could never get the inside of that Carson engine house warm, regardless of how warm it was outside. If the track could be upgraded to 75 or 90-pound rail, they recommended that the aged steam motor power be replaced by 2 70-ton diesel-electric locomotives at a cost of $70,000 each. The Allen Holgate Stutenberg report is a remarkable snapshot of the B&T's physical condition in the railway's 80th and final year. The text conveys a wealth of data, and the photographs provide specific examples of the construction, maintenance, and condition of the aging roadbed and track structures. This book is the first instance where our society has reproduced a B&T report verbatim in its entirety from a typescript original. Few original reports are known to survive. This report should be a valuable resource for the aficionado, scale modeler, and historian alike, and we hope you concur. So if we can take the lights down, let's take a look at some of the visuals that are in this. Thank you, Ken. Sampson's letter was the way that got all this started, and so we've included this 6-page letter. It's interesting that he labels it as being confidential. It's sent to all 3 of the consultants, as well as to his boss, Doug McLeod, down in San Francisco, and gives them the various ICC classifications that they're supposed to use and how they organize the report. Sampson went through and put the history of tie replacements on the railroad. They verify that, and there's some pencil annotations, which varies just very slightly from what Sampson said. And then it's broken down to all the major facilities that they address. This is everything from Reno through Carson City, all the way down to Minden. Includes specifications for the motive power at that point, and some pretty specific directions to them. And so this got them started. And the result was this final report. For those of you youngsters in the room who don't know what this is called a typed original. This is done with what we call carbon paper on onion skin, back before the days of Xerox. And so this is probably the second carbon copy. We've enhanced it, but I think it's still fairly readable. So it goes through page by page. For example, here's one of the bridges at Steamboat. Tells you which one it is, how long it is, the engineering station, what it's made of, when it was put in, how much it cost, and what it's going to cost in order to bring it up to snuff. And so that's done with every single one of the track structures. Then an assessment is done on every single one of the buildings. If you've seen the ICC valuation worksheets that Ken Christensen has on his website, Here's the information, but it's all typed, so it's much easier to get through. So this is for every single structure from Reno all the way down to Minden, just a sample page, and that just happens to be, I think that's the section house at Reno. I mean, just about any information and all information you need to model it. And then there's several pages where they just walk the main line. Here's all the rails as of 1917, the condition of them in 1949. It tells you when it was put in, what its weight is, and when it was manufactured. Includes the main line as well as all of the side tracks. So if you're into minutia, this report has got it. Then there's these delightful photographs, and they're wonderful because the professional photographer rode the motor car and pointed his camera, and the majority of these have not been published, but they offer some real insight as to the state of the railway at that time. Alan was, as we mentioned, the fourth witness in the abandonment proceedings. I do have a typescript of all of the abandonment proceedings. It's about 600 pages of all of the testimony, and I pulled a little bit out in which he talks about it. In the report he mentions this is a 138-foot long bridge. It was last repainted in 1913. Portal bracing at the top is broken. The girders have got a little character to them, and he'd gotten an estimate of around $4,500 in order to bring it back into compliance. Whoops, a little aggressive there. The turntable, he pointed out, secondhand, 57-foot turntable. The ball and socket joints bearing is worn from heavy use. He talks about the foundation. The apron deck is dangerous and needs to be replaced. Nearest other place to turn an engine is the Sparks 3 miles away, so he recommended complete replacement. And the cost at that point for a new turntable was only $25,000. He took a look at the engine house and he had some acute assessments of that. The engine house, quote, is in bad condition. It shows its age, built in 1871. Present building is of no use except to keep prowlers away from engine. Very little protection from the elements. Pit walls are disintegrated. Mortar is powder. Should all be replaced. A new pit was going to be $1,500. A new engine house was $10,000, and decent facilities for the use of the men would be about $500. So altogether, around $12,000. Curtis is going to talk about this building a little bit later. The addition on the north end, you can see they've got an oil tank car they're using for fuel supply. And here's second number 6 that's detrucked for the hostler to live in with his family. And then some wonderful detailed photographs of the condition of the track. And this is, you talk about the condition of the railway if they could just hang on for a few more years. This is the benefits of having no tie plates. And you can see how the rail is just deeply cutting down into the ties. Here, let's see, here's a situation where the section crew was fairly resourceful. They took a piece of tie and just stuffed it underneath that joint to provide a little bit of support. This is not approved railroad construction techniques here that you were looking at. Here was the situation where the original bent, let's see, this trestle had been replaced in 1912. Its estimated lifespan was 12 years. Here it's still in place. The foundations are fairly good for those bents. You can see the original bents. He's pointing out how they're dry rot. There's no wood right in the center of it. And so what the B&T crew did in 1937 was come through and put all this false work on both sides in order to try and hold them up. Again, this is not recommended construction practices. Here's another one with that additional false work, and you can see that, and even the false work has dry rotted by this point. So there's not a lot of holding up those stringers. Here's the situation in 1937. This is the piece, the vent that they replaced. They just took the sill cap off. You can see the mortise and tendon joints for the construction of that. They put up a lightweight pine vent, and it's already got dry rot in it as well. So there's a lot of heavy praying that's going on here as the train crews go over some of these small bridges in Washoe Canyon. This is not an approved style of railroad construction, but it's something the section crew came up. And so Alan had a photograph included in this just to show how resourceful some of the B&T folks were in trying to keep things together. The circles indicate here just a little cribbing. They took an old tie that looks like it was dry rot at one end and stuck it underneath the joint to support the joint. Here's a case where there's such settling that you could see daylight underneath the rail, so they got some little boxwood shims and stuck them in under the rail. And there's an awful lot of incidents of that just to keep the railroad going. This is the Franktown water tank, and you can see that all the water that's continued to spill over here. There's a little wow or two in the ceiling up here on the tank, and then an awful lot of dry rot. The number for the Franktown tank wasn't too bad. It was about $2,100 to replace the deteriorated metal, and then let's move it on. Also repaint the tank. Sorry about that. Here's another one, Washoe Valley, where some of the wall was starting to give away, and so they put another bent in just to try and keep the wall intact. Of course, one of the big sources of problem was the extra heavy second number 25. You're supposed to boo and hiss when you see this. Broke at least a dozen rails the first time it made a trip over the railroad. They pulled number 27 out of the engine house in order to take this shot. These two photos, and then a nice detail about the excellent condition of the driver tire. And you can see how that's nicely dished, and that really helped keep it on the rail. Particularly when you have drivers that are flanged on both sides. Very, very innovative, very ingenious. Pointed out how several of the wood trusses had failed inside the roof on the engine house, and that's why you're seeing the dips there. There's quite a number of those. They call it a roundhouse. Of course, the V&T only had one roundhouse. That was up in Virginia City. All the rest of them technically were what we call engine houses. Standard V&T switch, well, it wasn't real standard. This happens to be a three-way stub switch. And a number of the points of these, or the edges had broken off, were a source of derailment. And one of the real problems that the V&T had, of course, was during hot weather, why the rail would expand. And we have pictures, I have one in the Arcadia book I did, where the crew is actually out sawing off the edge of the switch, the point of the switch, so they can throw the switch, because during the hot weather it's expanded so much they couldn't get the stub switch operable. But during cold weather you can see the gap that was created there, and there were several derailments here as a result of that. This is a nice detail here. You can see the gauge rods holding this all together, and those points of the switch, the three-way switch. This is from the depot looking into the yard. This one here on the main line is looking down Stewart Street. And a lot of rail braces that they used on curves. These were cast in the Carson shops in order to keep curve rails from bending over. And then the Carson River Bridge. This had been a real source of problem. 480 feet long, 3-stringer, 15 bent. Bridge is unsafe for speeds in excess of 5 miles an hour. The bridge was built in 1905, destroyed in 1907, rebuilt at once, partially destroyed by fire in 1948, and cobbled together by the section crew. And you can see what great shape it is in at that time. What the V&T crew is in between the regular bends, they developed this false work with boxwood shims in order to keep the stringers from sagging when the train went over it. And there's not just one, but there's several dozen of these that are interspersed, and they're already starting to have dry rot. This is not approved bridge construction. Something you can model though, because the crew had put these in the late 30s, so they were there in between these substantial pieces that date back to 1907 in order to hold these stringers up. And again, the sections, small sections of ties have just been inserted at joints to keep the crystallized rail from breaking. They did use tie plates on, this is that 56-pound relay rail that was put in on the Minden branch. It was always called a branch, even though it was mainline service up until 1950. And you can see some of the nice wows, the character so typical of that lightweight 56-pound rail. Switch points where they'd been broken off and had been several derailments. One of the last railroads to still use stub switches in this country. They were running 26. These pictures were taken in April of 1949, again by John Stiles out of Carson City. A little snow still on the Carson Range. Of course, they built the combination depot at Minden, and at the time Dangberg had talked about developing some kind of a large public building, perhaps a hotel. And so they didn't build a waiting room, but then the hotel didn't come along until about 1917. So then the V&T had to go in and build this passenger waiting room, and that's why there's a separate waiting room down at Minden. And of course, this is the agent's quarters. down here on the other side. The sign here is for the Minden Inn. These are some of the extra photographs that didn't make it into the report. Notice all the fine ballasting that they have here. There is no grade, there is no profile, there is no drainage. We talk about rails in the dirt or rails in the mud. This is it. I mean, basically, this is dirt and mud that's holding all this together. And there's just absolutely no drainage here for the most part. So when you're getting snow and you're getting heavy rain, there's no place for it to go. So there's an awful lot of standing water. And there's no reason, you know, that's the reason when they salvaged the B&T in late 1950s, they took the rail and the track hardware, but didn't bother with any of the ties. I mean, there's nothing there to save. These are taken going up the grade to Lakeview, and you can see a little bit of the motor car, the B&T motor car that they're using there. There's just no ballast to speak of. This is rails in the mud, rails in the dirt, helping to hold it all together. There is no vegetation or fire abatement program, so you can see the weeds grow freely along the railroad tracks as well as between the tracks. And these are rails that they were operating over 6 days a week. So a fairly deteriorated physical plant. A gold mine of information for modelers. There's also a few sketches which we reproduce as well. This is a nice one. This is the West Carson engine house, and you can see it doesn't have any floors. No reason they actually, well, no wonder why they didn't put braces on this, and they did later on in order to support it to keep it from blowing over. Because this basically has a dirt floor, and they had the 3 tracks in there, the West Carson engine house. This is the 54-foot cast iron seller's turntable. You know, the technology exists in order to make a turntable like this today, but there isn't anybody in this country who is doing a casting that big. So this is 2 separate castings, 22 feet long, and that was the turntable here in Carson City. Nice drawing of the engine house. These are all in the report. And details of the engine house. So just an excellent document. First time we've actually reproduced a B&T report verbatim, but we think it's worthwhile because of the information. And reproduce the photograph reproduction quality is excellent. It's worth the, just to get the photographs as well. And I hope you find it a good source of information and a worthwhile addition to your library. I want to just quickly mention the other publication, lest you think we were idle this past year. This is the other one that we did this year, and this is B&T General Superintendent Henry M. Yarrington, A Family Album. I've been impressed over the years reading the Yarrington letters. There's about 60,000 of these, and I started in them in the early 60s, reading them at the Bancroft Library. The more you know about H.M. Yarrington, the greater understanding you get of how the B&T operated and why it was the way it was to a very large extent. And so between these 2 covers is the most information we could find about Yarrington. There's more sandwiched in these 2 covers than on any other book about H.M. Yarrington, so I commend it to you. And unless you think it's just a biography, there's a good deal of B&T information here as well. We found that Yarrington was born in Canada in 1829. Along Lake Erie, and then they went on down to Lake Ontario in Canada. It was called West Canada because it was the wilderness at that point. We think of that as East Canada, but at that time they called it West Canada. He went to local schools, and then his father sent him to military school. And H.M. Yarrington did the same thing with his son, so like father, like son. Yarrington's father, Albert, and there's a picture of Albert in the book, operated a good-sized machine shop, and they built boilers up to 100 pounds boiler pressure, so fairly substantial. So Yarrington worked around the shop. He did some bookkeeping for them. So he picked up a real appreciation of good machinery and good practice and what machines were at a very early age. And then he went into business with this fella. He graduated from college. He went to work as a secretary to a division superintendent on the Grand Trunk Railway, who would eventually become his uncle. It's probably there that he met his first wife, Susan Mary Hume. This is their marriage license. They were married in Ohio. This is a very young H.M. Yarrington and his wife, Susan Mary Hume. So he had the railroad experience of working for a superintendent. And then he went into business as a grain merchant with this fellow, whose name is Samuel Shepherd. And they would buy the grain in the United States. They owned their own boat. It was the Mary, which they operated on the Great Lakes. So he had some boating experience as well. He dealt with grain and he dealt with mills, because they would grind it. And they would sell it, resell it, hold it. They had warehouses, held it for about 6 months. Would sell it in Canada and also as far away as England. So when he came to Nevada in 1863, he had quite a smorgasbord plate of various talents that he brought along with him, which he used to his advantage. As we know, he started out as a mill owner of the Merrimack Mill. He knew about machinery. He knew about railroads. He knew how to set up the Carson shop. He'd seen a good machine shop. And so a lot of his life experience was preparing him for the job he had here in Carson City. Also in Port Stanley, where he was raised, there were two big industries in Port Stanley. One was the grain business, the milling business, and the other was the lumber business, with a lot of French-Canadian lumberjacks. And that just played in so well with the 20 different companies that he helped get started to harvest the lumber available around here, as well as Lake Tahoe. So it's an interesting story. As you find out more about Yerington, you find out all of the skills that he brought with him. Fortunate for us, his son, James Albert, became interested in photography. And in 1889, he bought a half glass plate camera. It was shot half a plate with a good-sized lens. And he knew how to develop it. And so we have wonderful shots like these from the family album of their house, which is Division and Robinson. It still stands. It's a lot more expansive than this. Shots along the B&T. He took interior photographs of their house. In fact, this carved mahogany beam is still in the home today. This is looking into the dining room and their parlor and their sitting room. It came at a good time, 1889, 1890. Well, we'll say it's a good time. It was a bad time for Yerington, but plenty of derailments and one of the harshest winters to deal with. Albert, we used the camera for about 15 years and then passed it on to his brother, Edward. And they used it, these are early portraits of Yerington from the family scrapbooks. They used it along on the business cars and took it along on various trips. Here's a picture of Robert J. Laws at his desk in 1892, a candid photo. Quite remarkable. They took it along their trips on the CNC, various inspection trips. This is Candelaria, this is Rhodes March, this is Aurora, Inyo Development Company. Here's water in Owens Lake when they had water in Owens Lake. So there's some wonderful images that we've not seen anyplace else. Yerington had quite a public life. He was quite a public figure. He liked to go down to San Francisco with his wife. That's where all of his clothes were purchased. They bought all the furniture for their house down there. He had a separate bank account through Wells Fargo. Had some health issues that we talk about here. Obviously, at one point he had surgery on one of his ears and they operated on the wrong ear. And then shortly after that, they thought it would be well if they took out his eardrums to equalize the pressure. So he was basically deaf the last several decades of his life. As a result, he was very loud, he was very gruff, because he couldn't hear very well. And Clara, his second wife, would have to write cryptic notes to him. But he, down underneath, he was very warm and very caring. We have a number of candidates which are just great. This is Yerington sitting in the parlor at home. He was a voracious reader. They subscribed to all kinds of newspapers. And here he is reading, catching up on one of the newspapers at home. He was a man of privilege. Even when they lived in Canada, they had a servant. And when they lived here in Carson City, we know from the census that they had at least 4 people. Ida Higgins was the housemaid. She lived with them in the house. And then they had at least 3 to 4 Chinese. This one is Gilbert, who took care of the landscaping. They had a barn out back, a horse. They had a cow. They always had chickens. This is Gilbert and Yerington. You can see how tall he was in a makeshift sleigh. And Gilbert's taking him to the office early on one morning. And it was Bird Sawyer, who was Birdie, who was the wife of Samuel C. Bigelow. I interviewed her, and she said she remembered H.M., and he would always holler at her because he'd get the sidewalk shoveled off, and it was still sort of icy, and the kids would walk to school, and he'd get out there and tell them to get off there because he was afraid they might slip and fall. Then they'd sue him, and that was the last thing he needed. And she remembers him just yelling at the top of his lungs to Gilbert because he just wasn't driving the right way in order to get to the office. But the grandchildren remember him as somebody very kind and kind-hearted. He loved his claret after dinner, loved his cigars. They had a big wine cellar in the house, a big root cellar, and he always loved a game of solitaire. Nothing aided digestion, I guess, like a good game of solitaire. So here he is just after dinner in the corner of the dining room. Here's the boys around the card table. You can see him with the silvery hair, and these are his sons and grandsons, and they're playing cards. And then this nice little candid shot about 1903. This is his second wife, Clara Bender, and Yarrington's catching a Sunday afternoon nap, and just huge hands, huge fingers, and with their sleigh outside the house there in Carson City. Of course, he made it into the new century, negotiated with Dangberg to get the right-of-way to go on to Minden. This is what Minden looked like about that time. He prevailed upon his boss, D.O. Mills, to go ahead and order the McKean car. Unfortunately, Mills died in January of 1910 before the car arrived, so he never saw it on the B&T. But here's a shot of Clara and D.O. Mills' son, Ogden, with the car. And probably the last known photograph of H.M. Yarrington is on the platform with his walking stick on May 13, 1910, during the maiden voyage of the McKean car going down to Minden. I think the loss of his boss was kind of the final straw. Yarrington died shortly thereafter that in November of 1910. It was the largest funeral at that time in the history of Carson City, with over 100 carriages making the procession out to the cemetery. They sat several times for well-known photographer Arnold Genthy down in San Francisco. We've included those portraits. There's over 200 illustrations in the book. This is Clara, his second wife, and their child, Dr. Henry Herbert, which was a well-known surgeon down in San Francisco, and the Yarrington plot in the cemetery. I've worked up a list of all the companies I could find that Yarrington was involved with as a director, as an officer, as a major controlling stockholder, and I stopped counting at 69. And they are mines, railroads. Look at all the different railroads as far away as Washington. Mining companies, milling companies, wood companies, flume companies, toll roads, just other ventures. When he died in 1910, he was president of 16 different companies at that time throughout California and Nevada, as well as Washington, California, Eastern California. He had properties also in the Motherlode as well. Judy Yarrington was very gracious in making the family Bible available. The Bible was given to Yarrington when he graduated from college, and in it were all of the birth and death dates, the marriage dates, and so there's several pages just devoted to the Yarrington genealogy, and then a couple pages each on the major children. There's several pages. Edward, it's Boucher is the way it's pronounced. It's French, and Boucher is French for butcher, which might indicate where the family came from. So Edward was the secretary for the B&T. He lived in Virginia City. This is their house in Virginia City, probably up on A Street. It's their front yard with his wife Ella Coxwell and 3 of their 7 children altogether. He was the secretary of the B&T. He moved down to Carson City when Bender left that job as General Freight passenger agent and moved down to San Francisco. This was sort of the black sheep of the family, Marvin Hume. It's interesting, all the kids are called by their middle name, and that was the case we found with H.M. Yarrington. He wasn't called Henry. His second wife called him Henry, but growing up, he was known by his middle name, which was Marvin. And that was true with all their kids. They were known, was called Hume, and Albert James, he was called James, and he actually changed his name later on to James Albert. So this is Marvin Hume. He was the general purchasing and supply agent for the B&T. He died in 1912 down at Wally's Hot Springs, just a little bit south of here. Albert James, or James Albert, was the great promoter for the railroad and for Nevada. He was the commissioner for the state of Nevada to half a dozen World's Fairs. And he would put these elaborate exhibits together about Nevada. And he's the one who had the camera, would take photographs and use a lot of these photos in order to promote the state. He did quite an expose about Mason Valley and promoting all of its agricultural values. And he's the one that we actually think that Pison Switch was renamed as Yarrington for. This seems most likely. So there's some new stories yet to be told here. And then the one daughter, Jenny Avery, they called her Avery. pictures of her up in Virginia City. She went along on the various trips, inspection trips. And she largely lived with the family, her mother's family, which was back in Detroit, the Spicer family. They had a home in Detroit and this little tiny cottage that was on Cushing's Island back in Maine. And her remains were sent out, and she's buried here in Carson City as well. So 2 good publications we commend to you. These are small press publications. On the Arrington book, I think we printed 125. So it's publications number 10 and 11 in our continuing series. We're up now to about 15 books altogether. And thank you for your support of those. I think sales of our publications as well as back issues at the Telegraph can account for almost half of the revenue that we generate by the Society. So I encourage you to pick one up. We have them today. They're $20 each. Afterwards, they'll be available for mail, by mail for $25 each. If we could have the lights back up, I'd be happy to respond to any comments or questions that you might have. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, suggestions, hot tips, rumors? Anything? Brian?
Just a comment in reading the biography of President Hoover's time in the White House. Upon leaving the White House, one of the first things that he and Ogden Livingston, Mills, did was to do a motor trip through the Nevada properties.
Right. And we have pictures of both of them touring the B&T, pictures of them in the Carson City on the platform and also up at Virginia City. It's about 33, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, yep. Other comments, questions, suggestions? Everybody's still waking up. Yes?
Just the date of that engineering report was April of '49, is that?
Yes, the report was actually researched and written from December 48 through February of 49. Then they came back and when the weather got a little warmer, took the photographs. I think the photo reproduction, I mean, it's worth that for the price of the photos. They really came out quite well. And if you're a modeler, just the information of the photos, it's well worth it. And then they used this for the abandonment proceedings, which started the next month in May of 49.
That's what struck me as the irony of the times then versus now, where the idea was, well, the track's in terrible condition, we need to shut down the railroad, but let's have an excursion run a month later.
Yeah, yeah, at 10 or 15 miles an hour, and we're going to hear from your dad, Hart, about that fine excursion. But you can see why there were such restrictions on the condition of the track, and why if they were going to do anything in terms of keeping the railroad going, it was really going to need a significant infusion of cash. There's no question when you look at those photographs, there is no ballast there. I mean, it's gone. Anything else? Yes?
Yeah, the pictures you were showing, the section hands were doing repair work on the bridges. And
Yes.
like that. How long would the railroad have to shut down during the operation?
Well, basically, you've only got one train. Train number 2 is the first one down. It's got a 4-hour layover at Minden, so you've got some daylight hours there for them to be able to work. And they're operating 6 days a week, so you can get out there on Sunday. And I don't think it takes too long to take an old crate to get the boxwood and to put those shims in on top of the ties and the rail. You can do that fairly quickly. I mean, the engineer can almost get out and do that before he's got to run over it. And when they got down to the tail end, there's largely just one big section crew that's working out of Carson City. It's wondered they didn't have more serious accidents than they did, but they were operating at a very low speed, so that was their saving grace. Anything else? Yes?
Yeah, what was the size of the gang, section gang?
Well, they used to have 18 section gangs when the B&T got started, and fairly substantial gangs. They had made great use of Chinese initially because the Chinese were the ones who built the railroad, except up in Story County where the labor unions were very strong and they weren't allowed to use Chinese up there. But the early section crews received payrolls or 7, 8 members plus the section foreman. So you have a section house where the section foreman lives, and then you have a bunkhouse largely for the Chinese where they would all live.
And by 48, what was it down to?
48, they had 3 section crews. They had Reno, Carson City, had one at Minden. They gave up the one at Lakeview in the late 40s. 1950, they had one big crew basically out of Carson City that would go, strike team that would go where they were needed. when something goes off the track, well, I guess we better go do some track work there. Anything else? You've been most attentive. Thanks so much.